Hello again, GRC community. Welcome back to another video tutorial. And this is the first one of 2020 to help you get started and make the best of ServiceNow governance, risk, and compliance applications. This is Eric Ferron in Santa Clara, California. And today, my guest, Ben Forrest, is back on the show. Ben is Principal Technical Trainer, and you may have taken a class with Ben. And if you have not, you probably will. Good afternoon, Ben, and welcome back.
Hey, thank you, Eric. It's a pleasure to have this opportunity to speak to everybody. And Happy New Year, everyone. Hope you're enjoying the new year and ready to make some GRC resolutions.
GRC resolutions, absolutely. So Ben, today, once again, you're going to share with us some valuable pieces of advice that you have distilled from your great experience of ServiceNow and of GRC in particular. The title of this episode is very promising. Become a GRC athlete. I love it. So you're going to be a bit like a coach to us today, right?
That's right. I'm going to put you through your paces. We're going to start doing some GRC burpees and maybe some pull-ups and some push-ups. No, actually, we're not going to do any of that. But we are going to try and focus, just like we might if we had made a resolution around fitness, right? We're going to start with some goals. Make sure that we have kind of our sights set on becoming the very best GRC practitioner we possibly can, one step at a time.
All right, so let me get us started first with our usual refreshers. Our tutorial series is primarily designed to help our audience get started with GRC applications and get value quickly. So we focus really on the very first steps that need to be taken to start getting value out of the applications. We will have in the future more tutorials for the more advanced members of our audience, but this is not our focus today. Now, here is a slide that you have not seen yet that brings together the 5 key online resources available to you. The first one is the Learning Center, where you will find all of the long-form training classes available to you. The second one is the product documentation site. Of course, the place of reference for all questions on the product itself. The Demo Center, that's pretty self-explanatory. There's actually a new version of this site, and there's a monthly program available January, February, and so on and so forth. Of course, hopefully everybody knows about the Hi portal to file a support ticket. And last but not least, the community, where you go to get fast answers to your questions from experts and from your peers, where you have the whole program of those free tutorials. And we strongly recommend to subscribe to those forums to get the most value. So enough of the introduction. Ben, the floor is yours for your coaching advice.
As I was mentioning earlier, we're going to really focus on our New Year's resolution of becoming more fit in the realm of GRC. And I think we can start with some of the basics. Before I begin, I want to mention that ServiceNow, we use our own methodologies here. We use our own products, and this product has evolved quite a bit over the last couple of years. We like to drink our own champagne, as we say here at ServiceNow, and that's really helped to evolve the product. So we started small, right? We started one use case, a handful of folks, and we really wanted to focus on the same kinds of things that I'm going to be talking with you guys about today. So the cake's been eaten. We've all celebrated. We want to make sure that we've got discipline, right? We want to be disciplined in our approach. We want to be committed to that approach, and we want to prioritize the right thing. So just like Covey used to say, first things first. And that's going to help us break out of our old roles, our old habits, our old ruts, and stop being reactive. So we want to focus on maybe a subset of use cases or even a single use case. And for many folks, that might be something like becoming SOX compliant or focusing on some of the business processes related to being able to prove to their internal and external auditors that they're compliant with Sarbanes-Oxley. Now, before we even start, it's really important for any athlete to have the right gear. You want to make sure that all of your settings, all of your favorites, all the places you need to work are easily accessible. So one of the first things that I often coach folks is set up your workspace. We talk about this in development, making sure that all of your tasks, all of your tools, all of the things that you need are within arm's reach. Just like with those kinds of principles, we're going to do the same thing here in GRC. And that means making sure that all of your primary work areas, things like if you're focused on doing policy compliance, making sure that you've got all of the necessary sort of entities scoped out already and that you've set them up with favorites. If you don't know how to use favorites, it's okay. I'm going to show you a couple of my quick and handy tips and tricks to make sure that you're navigating more quickly, more easily, and getting right to work right away. Now that we're moving, right, now that we're kind of getting started, we've got our track shoes on, we've got our goals in place, it comes time to actually start to do the work, day one of training. What does this mean for us? Well, like I said, we want to pick a subset, pick a single thing to work on, a single use case, maybe even a subset of that same use case, and focus on just getting that right. When you go to the gym, Oftentimes when we work with a trainer, we make sure that the person taking the class or learning about the particular movement focuses on going slow, getting the movement just right, so they don't hurt themselves or overextend themselves. And the same can be true here from a knowledge perspective. We want to focus on getting our process refined, making sure that we're doing the work in such a way that we're not creating more work for ourselves or others, we're not overextending, and that we're really kind of smoothing out some of those rough edges that might have made themselves apparent just after go live. We'll pick our subset of profiles, our subset of controls and potentially risks, move them into the monitoring state. This is really important. You might have a whole host of controls that are set to draft, but we're going to move a handful of them into the monitoring state just so we can see from start to finish the process of going through our attestations, going through our monitoring, setting up our indicators, and getting into our day-to-day cadence, making it a habit. Make sure that we have this process in place and practice and really focus on doing this day in and day out or week in and week out, and set a time to commit to this process. As we get better, as we get more comfortable with both navigating the platform and understanding the day in and day out sort of cadence of how the application works in this process of both doing our attestations or our risk assessments and making sure that we're compliant, getting into that sort of monitoring mindset, we're going to come back and really focus on the next set of things that need to be addressed. So oftentimes this involves bringing in some of our stakeholders, making sure that we understand the business needs, where most of our pain is coming from a regulatory burden standpoint, whether that be addressing some findings, perhaps a few issues that have cropped up over time and ways that we're trying to improve, and really focusing on taking on the next big challenge based on the needs of you and the business. Just to recap, we're going to make sure that we become more effective by setting up our workspace, being able to quickly navigate, dragging records, making sure that we set up our problem profiles, make sure that they're favorited, make sure that we save all of our necessary filters. I'm going to show you a couple of those here in a demo in a minute. Make sure that you modify the view so it works for you. When the implementation was going on and just before go live, a lot of the workshops focus on sort of hitting that 80% figure for most of our users. You might need some additional views or additional columns or additional insights. Thankfully, ServiceNow is flexible enough for you to be able to personalize your own settings and your own view to make the platform work for you. If necessary, you might have to work with the platform administrator. That's always something that's worth kind of considering as we go through our day-to-day functions. I want to say, last but not least, our agent workspace for GRC is coming in Orlando or possibly later. It's going to allow you to make this whole sort of discussion around flexibility in your workspace and your sort of workflow that much more enriched.
All right, thank you for this. You're going to take us through a little demo now, right?
Yep. As a matter of fact, I have a couple of sample use cases queued up and ready. I'll mention some of the things that help make at least my life in doing this sort of work a little bit easier. Let's start with some of the basics, right? Maybe newer to the platform, haven't taken a GRC class yet, or you've gone live and had kind of a brief overview. I will always remind folks that favorites are a big deal. So I'm actually going to impersonate another user here just to kind of show you an example of some of those favorites in action here. So here we might have what we might call an entity owner, right? So the person that's responsible for doing their attestations or setting up our risk examples here. And our user, Jake, has a couple of favorites set up. And to set up a favorite, it's as easy as hovering over next to a particular area in the application navigator, ensuring that they click the Add to Favorites. But I like to take it a little further, right? When we go over our Favorites tab, that's the little star here, you'll notice that maybe this isn't super easy to read. So the other thing I like to mention is that once you create a favorite, it's yours to mess with however you like. Jake might want to rename this, make it whatever color he likes. Different names for these, right? So that's kind of step one, making sure that we can go through quickly and easily rename those, make them our own. Another thing I'd like to mention to folks is if your environment where you're kind of working on or focusing on a couple of key areas, let's say that I'm doing some policy work back and forth. Let's say I've got a particular policy that I want to kind of go back and forth on. We've got some draft here. For any record in the system, I could just click and drag this over onto my application navigator. If I go to my favorites here, you'll notice that that shows up right away. I use this all the time for work that I'm kind of keeping on my desktop, as it were. So if I'm focused on a couple of different drafts this week, I might go ahead and click these and add them to my favorites. And of course, just like before, I can rename them. And me renaming this particular record in my favorites doesn't change the actual record itself, just my favorite. Let's say that I wanted to see some of my controls. Now, obviously, we've got my controls, all controls, etc. But if I'm looking at a subset, I can do a filter up here with the little coffee guy here, the little coffee filter. And we can construct whatever kind of filter we need to. By default, you'll see that it's looking at all controls in this particular field, or in this particular table, except the retired ones, because we don't really care about the retired ones at the moment. You can add on some additional criteria to that search. Maybe I'm looking at all controls related to a particular user or a particular status. So perhaps I need to find all that are in the monitoring state. There we go. A really cool thing that you can do, and this is something I often do with other applications as well, for any table, if you've got a particular filter that you like, guess what? Just like with our various records here, that of course we could click and drag over and save as favorites, we can do the same with a filtered list of records. And this is a really helpful little tip that will save you a lot of time, especially if you've got sort of a subset of controls or a subset of risks that you're always kind of checking on, or ones that you're currently auditing. You want to be sure that you have all of your ducks sort of in a row. What I'll do is I'll alter this particular filter here, again, by clicking on my filter builder here. Right now we've got state is not retired, is in the monitor. Let's also add a further component here. I want to get rid of the ones that say status. And we're not going to want to look at the non-applicable ones, right? So, right, because they're not applicable to our particular scenario here. We'll run that. Now we have a nice subset of records that we can look at, and we can even group these, if we like, by entity, for instance. And then we can take this and drag it right over here. And again, we can rename it to something that's worthwhile. So we could say applicable controls in monitoring state. And if I wanted to, we could just say, all right, well, let's just take a look at customer support ones, right? Because maybe I'm in charge of these particular controls, and we could create another filter that was just this subset, and so on. So you really let your sort of imagination run wild with some of the different filters that we might create and then save. And again, think about your day-to-day, what that might look like, and what you might want to see on a given list or subset of these, and make sure that you've got those sort of set up for you in sort of quick-fire fashion so you can really quickly get access to them. Now, the last couple of examples that I want to show you might require a little bit of additional sort of collaboration with you and your system administrator, your platform owner. But these particular little examples that I'm going to show you are quite helpful, for some of the daily care and feeding related to maybe getting through that first subset of controls or risks that you want to start to manage. The first is by kind of taking a look at some of the additional ways you can automate some of the things that might happen in response to kind of common occurrences, right? Companies are dynamic, enterprises change all the time. And some of your control owners and or entity owners might shift. They might be reassigned. You might go through a reorg. Well, what do we do in those situations to kind of buy ourselves a little bit of either peace of mind or create some additional time-saving features? To do this, you can take a look at the entities themselves. So if I look at some of my entity types here, we've got a couple of examples that I've set up here just for this trial run. Here is a subset of business applications that we've set up here, right? And each of the applications have some controls and or risks associated with them. You'll notice that we've set it up so that we can see who the owners of these particular entities are. And a cool thing that we can do is we can set up something called a flow to watch each of these in turn. So if there is a big change, let's say, for instance, that Mr. Michael Sullivan leaves the company or gets reassigned or finds an opportunity somewhere else outside of maintaining or watching some of these applications, you might want to notify someone or create an issue that you can assign as a compliance manager to other users. So if I were to deactivate Mr. Sullivan, so far I have nothing happening here other than we still see that Michael Sullivan owns a BitGlass entity. So he's no longer around, he's no longer with the company, but there are 11 different controls set up against this particular entity. Who's going to do something with them? We can do two things. I've set up in this particular example a flow designer flow. And again, this is something that can be created by one of your developers and or platform admins, or if you take one of our Now Learning courses, you can learn how to do this yourself and also collaborate with your team. What I've set up here is a very simple sort of if the user becomes inactive and they contain or the owner of a particular entity, simply create an issue. Now, if this looks rather confusing or you've never seen anything like this, again, I'll be posting some notes that you can reference and look up later. But this particular set of automation took all of about 5 minutes or so to set up. Basically, when that user was deactivated, we had it set up such that the system created an issue in our issues list here. So this then gets assigned to the compliance managers or whoever you would choose to assign these sorts of things to, with a series of a description and a recommendation. So let's say that this issue was brought up. I created another flow that when we go into our big class entity, let's say that we assign it to another user. Set up some more flows here that will look out for the risks and controls that were previously assigned to the other user. So if we get an entity change where the owner changes, the system then looks up all of the risk records, looks up all the control records, and updates them accordingly, and then sends the end user an email. So now Ray gets a notification that says, hey, you now own these other risks and controls because you've been assigned as the new entity owner for BitClass. And in just a moment, these little guys here will all update. So now that Michael Sullivan is no longer the owner, and we refresh the page there, they've all been reassigned to the new entity owner, and Ray's been given an email. Again, little tiny edges here. Those particular flows, fairly easy to create. You're not set up baseline because every company works just a little bit differently. But if your company works something like this, feel free to copy mine. We'll be posting some links, part of this particular episode, for you to reference over on the Now Learning platform, and a few other references over in our ServiceNow YouTube channel. Hopefully you found that useful, helpful, and maybe even a little inspiring.
All right. Well, thank you for this, Ben. Now, I think that we should take another look maybe at how ServiceNow implemented GRC and get back to that previous slide.
Yeah, would love to. We started out rather small. Essentially, we've defined a set of processes as it relates to SOX, and then set up a series of controls and risks for each one. And we started just there. Those are sort of company-wide, and so they have a rather large scope. But the way that we scoped those particular processes was very, very small at the beginning and small at the outset. So we were very laser focused in those early stages. And this was revamped in 2016 when we completely redid the entirety of the GRC application. And so again, starting as we did before, started small, made sure that we had our ducks in a row, and focused just on a subset of, in this case, specific SOX processes to get ready for our internal audit. Over the years, we've continued to layer additional components onto that so that we can continue to monitor and increase our scope. But the thing that you'll notice down here, and I think that this is particularly useful and helpful to understand, is that during this whole process, in terms of resources, we've got basically between 1 and 3 FTEs or full-time equivalents assigned to this sort of continuous improvement project, even running up into 2019 and ongoing into 2020. It's typically between 1 and upwards of 3 different people kind of doing the day-to-day functionality, either in terms of creating new flow designer flows, new notifications, and doing some of that design thinking in terms of how to make this work. So again, starting small, make sure that you're focused, got a goal in mind, and work daily to hit that goal before kind of starting to stretch out and challenge yourself by increasing scope.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Ben. So I think looking at the small cost of this program compared to the benefits, that's quite an inspiring story. Also, thank you very much for taking us to the detail of how to do things and how to get set up properly, and also this high-level picture on how a company like ServiceNow is implementing GRC with our own product. All right, so I think we've come to the end of the presentation. What I'd love for our audience, people who've been watching this video so far, what would be your advice? Where should they go? What should they do?
There's a couple of recommendations that I'm going to circle back with at the very end of the video, but it all boils down to kind of putting a stake in the ground and figuring one place out to start first. So you can follow our path if you'd like, and it's as easy as going to the applications here in ServiceNow. This is going to connect to the ServiceNow store. And if you do a search here in all applications, take a look for GRC. And if you scroll down, you'll find something called the SOX Content Pack. What this does is a couple things. It actually adds those processes, those specific SOX processes that I talked about, adds them to your CMDB locally. And on top of that, it actually does the entity scoping for you. Once it's installed, it also gives you a little dashboard, all of the necessary controls, all of the risks, and then defines your SOX processes here as they relate to the regulations itself. Now, once this is installed, obviously you'll have to add process owners, so a responsible party for each person, along with their department and any other descriptive elements that you want. But once you do that, everything else is fairly plug and play here, and is a really good starting point for a lot of organizations to kind of get their head wrapped around how this whole thing works. Now, once you've got that goal in mind, you've started to get your organization kind of behind you, and you figured out what you want to attain, make sure you share that first target and get support from the community as well. If you run into any kind of opposition, any kind of challenges, or you're just curious if anybody has found additional useful flows or created any additional rules or notifications around your particular challenge, go to the community and find out. I guarantee that one of us, whether it be somebody internal here at ServiceNow like myself or one of the other experts, or another member of the community who's facing a challenge very much like yours, we're here to help.
Well, thank you very much, Ben. I think we are at the end of this presentation. Just a few quick housekeeping reminders before we close off. Of course, the slides are available in PDF format on the forum. If you have questions, very much as Ben said, please come to the GRC forum. And we recently launched, and this is the right time for me to announce this, a dedicated forum specialized on policy compliance and risk for new customers, and the link will be included in the PDF version of the slides. And finally, to stay tuned, make sure you subscribe to these forums to get alerted about the next tutorials. So again, thank you very much, Ben. Thank you for your time. Thank you to our audience for listening. And until next time, goodbye.